Hi there! Welcome to the second part of my tutorial in which I show you how I develop my HDR night photographs using the tools DxO Photolab, Aurora HDR and finally Affinity Photo. In the last part we talked about preparing the HDR bracketing using the software DxO Photolab. We then exported the results into 16-bit TIFF files. In this video we are going to import those TIFF files into Aurora HDR in order to start the actual HDR process. Before we start, I'd like to address the fact that the language of the user interface of Aurora HDR on my computer is in German. Sadly, I've not found a way to change that to English. I will use the correct English terms wherever possible, and I'm sure you will be able to follow this tutorial nonetheless. Alright, let's start the process. What we've got here is the opening screen of Aurora HDR where you can open your images. Usually you would click on Open Image, select your images, click on Align because there might be some slight differences in the alignment. Here you can set chromatic aberration removal plus ghosting reduction. I usually select ghosting reduction because there is almost always some slight movement in my images. Here there are not many settings, you can only select the strength of ghost removal plus the reference image used for ghosting removal. Usually this is a trial and error process, meaning you have to try different settings in order to determine which one works best for the corresponding image. But in our case we cancel the process because I've already prepared an image. I click on Open Image once more. I select the file. I open it. And here we are. Now I'd like to introduce you to the user interface before we start the actual process. The user interface of Aurora HDR is actually quite simple. You have the preview area where you can always check the image. On the right you have the tools, the so-called filters, where you define the settings for your image. Plus you have this button here. If you activate it, Aurora HDR is presenting you with a preset selection. Aurora HDR comes with a lot of presets in different categories like basic, landscape, realistic, dramatic, and so on. These presets are a good starting point for further development, but I prefer to start from scratch, so I deactivate the button again. There's not much more to the user interface. What we have here also is the layers. You can add layers. This is a huge plus of Aurora HDR, the fact that you can work in layers. We are going to talk about these layers soon, and we are also going to make use of those layers for this image. Alright, now on to the actual development process. I've already created a basic layer for all the global adjustments. Let's quickly go through the different settings. Under HDR Basic we have exposure, contrast, which I usually reduce because Aurora HDR tends to create image with lots of contrast, and in order to get a more realistic result I usually reduce contrast. We have HDR Enhance, which if moved all the way to 100 creates a more HDR-like image, and if you restrain yourself like I did, you'll get a more realistic result. This is definitely a slider to experiment with in order to determine which setting works best for the corresponding image. But as a general rule, don't use it too intensively if you want to create realistic images. A value of 20, 30, something around that is usually right for realistic images. We have Smart Tone, which is basically a kind of a brightness slider, like you know from classical image editors. It darkens or brightens the mid-tones. Then we have highlights, shadows, white point, black point, nothing too fancy here. Next up we have colors. With saturation it's kind of the same as with contrast. Aurora HDR usually creates images where the colors are very saturated, and in order to get a more realistic result I usually decrease saturation a bit, in this case by -10. HDR structure is left alone for now. We are going to use this filter later on in a separate layer. The same for HDR noise reduction. Then there's radiance, for which I chose a strength of 20, and I chose to alter the color temperature to a slightly warmer color. Radiance is one of those sliders that determine whether you create a realistic or HDR-like photograph. I chose a value of 20 here because that's a good mixture between realism and the beauty of HDR. Then there's a pole filter setting, which I usually don't use. HDR detail enhancement, which we are going to use on a separate layer. Glow, like radiance, you can choose here between a very strong HDR effect and a subtler result. I chose a value of 10, and again I increased color temperature to a slightly warmer temperature. Next up is a very useful filter which lets you alter the exposure and color temperature for the sky and the foreground, or in other words the top and the bottom of your image. I chose to decrease exposure for the sky. I left contrast alone, and I chose to decrease color temperature so the colors become slightly colder. I did that to increase the color contrast between the foreground and the sky. Like you can see here, I increased the color temperature for the foreground And now we have improved the color contrast between sky and the foreground here, because in the foreground the dominant lights are the artificial lights of the streets and the houses, and of course we have the blue sky, which gives us a nice color contrast. Here we have the classical curves tool, where I drew a slight S-shaped curve for contrast, typical tool of classical image editors, which is also available in Aurora HDR. HSL is left alone for now. Color tones too, and we have a dodge and burn tool, which we also don't use at this stage. You can also add a vignette, but it's also not the time to do that. Alright, that concludes our basic image layer for the global adjustments. Next up, we are going to add a few more layers in order to do some local adjustment. The next step is noise reduction. As you can see in the sky, there is quite some noise, which we are going to address now. For this, we create a new layer and we increase the amount of noise reduction to, let's say, 40. Smoothness we leave it at the default value of 100, and the boost slider well, let's say 20. Okay, the effect is too subtle. Let's increase the amount to 50. Alright. Now the noise has been significantly reduced, and any remaining noise will be addressed later on in the final editing in the image editor, because the noise reduction tool in Aurora HDR isn't very sophisticated. It's actually quite poor in my opinion, because it's not very subtle. If you apply it to the whole image, you lose a lot of detail, far more than you would if you performed noise reduction, for example, in Affinity Photo or in Photoshop. So that's also why I want to restrict the effect on the sky here and leave the foreground alone, where I really want to retain all the details. So in order to do this, we create a mask. We want an opacity of 50%, that's okay. The size of 100 is also okay. And let's paint over the sky. If you click on this button with the eye, you can show the actual mask. Okay, we have to paint over here. And again, because I want full opacity for this area, all right. And now I select erase and paint over the areas that I don't want to be influenced by the noise reduction layer. Right, let's reduce the size of the brush in order to paint over the tower. Okay. Reduce it once more for the top. And again to increase the coverage around the tower. Here, here, here. Okay, this should do it. Let's close the mask editor and take a look at the result. As you can see, there is quite a difference in the sky. And in order to fine-tune the effect, you could also work with the opacity of the entire layer by reducing it or by increasing it. And because, like I said, the algorithm of the noise reduction offered by Aurora HDR isn't very sophisticated, I usually tend to keep the amount of noise reduction applied to a minimum, so I don't go for an opacity of 100%, but instead I reduce it to let's say, well, 80%, I think 80% is right. Yeah. The remaining noise you can see here will be taken care of later in the classical image editor. In my case, that's Affinity Photo, because there I can work with much more sophisticated tools to reduce noise. The next step is sharpening. Because we did not apply any sharpening during the raw conversion in DxO Photo Lab, the image definitely lacks some sharpness. You can see this, for example, in the yard here, or over there on the surface of the water. In order to address this, we create a new layer. Before we start to tweak the settings, we click on the brush and select Luminance, which creates a luminance mask. The luminance mask is a helpful tool to keep your image realistic. It does this by selectively applying the effect to bright and dark areas. This works as follows. The effect is stronger in bright areas and weaker in dark areas. Alright, we are ready to start the actual sharpening process. For this we use two different tools. The first is called HDR Structure. HDR Structure offers three sliders for amount, softness and boost. In our case we set a value of 25 for amount and leave softness and boost alone. We continue with the amount for HDR microstructure. Here we select the value of 20 and again we leave softness alone. Now we can switch to the second tool, which is called HDR Detail Boost, and it offers sliders for small, medium and large details. For the small details we select the value of 20, and for the medium and also for the large details a value of 15 is right. Protection and mask are not needed in this case, so we leave them alone. Now if we look at the result we can clearly see a difference. I can switch the effect off, which brings us back to our original image, and I can switch the effect on again, and if we look at the image, the amount of sharpening and detail enhancement is almost too strong. So in order to keep the image realistic, I fine-tune the effect with the opacity. In our case I reduce the opacity to 70, which gives me a much more subtle result, but still sharpens the image and brings out those details. Now on to the final step in Aurora HDR. In this step I'd like to brighten or darken certain areas of the photograph. In order to do so, I create another layer and I scroll down to the Dodge and Burn tool. I click on Start Painting, and the first thing I want to do is brightening this area here. So I select the brightening brush. I choose a size of 30 and a strength of 10. Zoom in a bit and I start painting over the desired area. Okay, the effect is not yet strong enough. That's why I paint over the area once more. Let's do a comparison. Yes, that looks good. The next area I'd like to brighten is the area over here. I use the same settings, and once more I paint over the desired area. Because the effect is not strong enough, I paint over it once more. And let's do another comparison. Looks good. The last area I'd like to treat is this one here, the street, which is too bright in my opinion. That's why I select the darkening brush. I increase the size to 50. Well, 51 will also do it. I leave the strength at 10% and I paint over the area. Again, I'd like a stronger effect, so paint over it a second time. Let's do a comparison. All right. Now we can fine-tune the effect with the strength slider here. We can set it all the way to 0 to deactivate the entire effect and switch it up to 100 again. And in this case I'd like to go with a value of 75. Yes. That's all there is to do in Aurora HDR. The only thing is left is to export the image. Select the path, choose a file name. Yes, I want to overwrite. I want to export it as a TIFF file. I don't want any additional sharpening. I want to leave the size as in the original, resolution the same. I want to export it as an sRGB image. I want an LZW compression, a bit depth of 16-bit, and I click on export. Yes, I want to overwrite. That's all there is to do in Aurora HDR for this photograph. The next step will be to finalize the image in a classical image editor like Affinity Photo or Photoshop. In my next tutorial I am going to show you how to do this. But for today it's time to say goodbye. I hope you liked the tutorial. If you want, subscribe to my channel, leave a comment or like the video. Thanks for watching and goodbye.